We all are born with a certain package. We are who we are. Where we were born, who we were born as, how we were raised. We're kind of stuck inside that person. And the purpose of civilization and growth is to be able to reach out and empathize a little bit with other people. Find out what makes them tick, what they feel about, what they care about. And for me, the movies are like a machine that generates empathy. If it's a great movie, it lets you understand a little bit more about what it's like to be a different gender, a different race, a different age, a different economic class, a different nationality, different profession, different hopes, aspirations, dreams, and fears. It helps us to identify with the people who are sharing this journey with us. And that, to me, is the most noble thing that good movies can do, and it's a reason to encourage them and to support them and to go to them.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. Today we are discussing the documentary No Other Land. Briefly, No Other Land follows Basel and Yuval Abraham as they document the destruction of Masafer Yatta. It is a wonderfully candid documentary that documents the destruction of a community in the West Bank, as well as the friendship of two men on opposite sides of an unequal fence. The documentary utilizes decades of footage from Basel's childhood, as well as footage Basel and Yuval shot together. As a team, they explain what it means to be occupied and what resisting an occupation looks like. The documentary begins at the start of the demolition orders. The film is paced quite brilliantly. We are following them day to day, so from morning to night. So it feels like we're waking up with them and we're going to bed with them. It also takes us inside the home of the average Palestinian living in these communities, and simply observing the contrast between these Palestinian families and the Israeli army is enough to showcase the grave imbalance of power here. I thought this format of following different families around as they try to readjust and decide whether or not to stay in their homes really allowed audiences to empathize with their situation and see them as no different from their own families. I also thought the way this documentary was organized from morning to night allowed us to appreciate how violent and how quick the Israeli army is destroying these communities, and also the magnitude of this destruction. And essentially, we are witnessing the destruction of a society, a civilization, a whole way of life. I also felt the documentary was very natural. None of the conversations felt forced or inauthentic in any way. And it never explains anything to you. There are no narrators, there's no brief synopsis. It just shows you. The community in Masafer Yatta are essentially struggling for recognition and survival. Briefly, in 1999, the Israeli government ordered the evacuation of Palestinians in Masafer Yatta to make way for a military training ground. After 2 decades of legal battles, the Israeli High Court greenlit the expulsion of the people in these communities. Despite the obvious illegality of the situation, neither the international community nor the mainstream media were able to put enough pressure to stop it. Under international law, an occupation is supposed to be temporary. The displacement of people in Masafer Yatta, as well as the destruction of their infrastructure and their homes, is not an occupation. It's essentially irreversible annexation. The order issued by the Israeli High Court triggers a reign of terror, which is documented by Yuval and Basel. The tension between the Israeli government and the Palestinians is absolutely catastrophic. And I felt the documentary did a great job of capturing the fear, what people must feel like going through this terror. No one in Masafer Yatta knows exactly when their homes will be destroyed once the demolition order is made. They tend to come at odd hours trying to catch them off guard. Once they find out that their homes will be destroyed, they have very little time to gather all their belongings, and you see it in the documentary. Tanks are literally circling homes. People are escaping from windows because the Israeli army is barricading them inside. To make matters worse, Palestinians are not compensated for their loss, and they end up having less than what they had before, which was barely anything. The documentary is incredibly triggering. You're watching mothers and fathers shield their children while their livelihoods are being destroyed in front of them. And I think simply witnessing the demolition is very effective in explaining what it looks like to occupy a land and its people. It goes beyond physical destruction. It's emotional, it's intellectual, it's spiritual. The Israeli army not only attempts to destroy their home, they confiscate anything that would enable them to rebuild, such as bathrooms, generators, cars, and even building tools. The purpose of these demolition orders is to prevent Palestinian villages from expanding and to make the land so inhospitable that they are either sentenced to a slow death or they have no choice but to move away. And what we're watching is almost hard to believe. We are witnessing the Israeli army not just destroy homes, but cut power lines, block water wells, plow over children, all with the explanation that their very existence violates the law. And I'm not really sure how a water well becomes illegal, or why electricity would be considered a security threat, or why their bathrooms would be a danger to the Israelis, but somehow they've managed to find a way to do so. The whole time I'm watching this documentary, I'm wondering how come they don't leave some of the infrastructure in place, because they will need it anyways for their supposed military training ground. For the Israelis to justify their occupation of the Palestinians, they have to create a narrative where the Palestinians never existed in the first place, one in which they are the invaders and they are the occupiers. A lot of the infrastructure that we see in the film, such as Israeli settlements, walls, roads, are all meant to solidify the annexation of this territory to Israel. And the end result is clearly shown in the film. Palestinians are forced into these smaller and smaller spaces. A lot of the infrastructure that these Israelis build in Palestinian territory, such as this military training ground, has been done by violating humanitarian and human rights norms. And the scene is horrifying. Families are literally forced out of their homes. You see tanks and bulldozers circling these tiny like homes, these farm areas. It's hard to know what the Palestinians are supposed to do in this situation. These Israelis are throwing tear gas in the vicinity of children, and the whole thing is just so violent. And the restrictive laws that Israel has placed on Palestinians has actually made it impossible for them to leave even if they wanted to. If you're a Palestinian in the West Bank, you cannot leave the West Bank. You cannot go to another Palestinian territory, say like Gaza, and try to find adequate health care or more resources. You're just stuck. If you need health care or you want to provide a better education for your children, there's really nowhere else to go. And the location of this military training ground, it is in civilian territory. And so you kind of wonder, is there nowhere else you could have built this training zone? And the way the Israelis build their infrastructure to disrupt Palestinian life is to make sure that they are unable to ever become autonomous without them. And to make matters worse, this infrastructure is so extensive that it makes it almost impossible for Palestinians to reverse it even if they wanted to. The Israeli demolition order enables the media to start creating false narratives about the Palestinians, mostly that those who continue to live in Masafer Yatta are trespassers who should be removed by force. And the claim is so absurd. These families have been living there for generations and generations, and a lot of the orders being carried out by the Israelis is almost so petty, and it's so absurd. They actually run out of things to take from them. I think the Israelis have done a brilliant job of using the law to sanitize their criminal behavior. Like, one of the demolition orders was on a playground. And I'm just thinking, what did the playground do? Why can't you leave the playground alone? And the way the Israelis justify their order is that they need this military training ground to protect their territory and their citizens, one of these citizens being Yuval. Yuval is an Israeli journalist that tries to combat the mainstream media in Israel. Up until now, the Israeli government has had a total monopoly over the news coverage. Yuval's presence in Masafer Yatta is proof of how the Israeli government often actively discourages Palestinians and Israelis from cooperating. And one thing the documentary makes clear without actually explaining or having to say anything is that this is active policy. These are not one-off incidences. Israelis who paint Palestinians in a positive light are often threatened or harassed. And the reverse is true for Palestinians. Palestinians who work with Israelis who try to paint them in a positive light are also threatened and harassed. And I think watching Yuval be welcomed by Basel's family as well as the community really undercuts the idea that the Palestinians are the aggressors in this relationship. And I really felt for Yuval because he really tries his best to cover these demolitions, hoping that he can help draw more attention to the problem. And unfortunately, their coverage is nowhere near enough to stop these Israelis from eviscerating their home. What makes this documentary very unique is the friendship between Basel and Yuval. Yuval is a journalist by choice. He can chase any story he wants. He can abandon any story he likes. Basel is a journalist and activist by force. He really has no other choice. One of my favorite parts of this documentary is getting to know Basel and his family, his father in particular. From Basel's home videos, we can see that his family has been fighting long before he was ever born. And Basel's father is a whole character by himself. Despite his age, he's very energetic and he is ready to fight. I think some people were born to resist, and he is just one of them. And Basel's father is known in the community. He has been repeatedly arrested, and even in the documentary, he's arrested again. And one of the tactics the Israelis use is this uncertainty. You never know who they're coming for or when they're gonna come for you. And in this case, it was his father. And this tactic of using this uncertainty, of keeping everyone on their toes, is a way to terrorize, punish, and humiliate them into submission. One of the things I appreciated about this documentary is it's organized in a way for the audience to understand the different levels of violence the Israeli government inflicts on Palestinians. It begins with the law, then these demolition orders, then the actual demolition, and then the violence from the Israeli settlers who want to move to these territories. The Israeli government often encourages Israeli citizens to settle on Palestinian territory with the promise of protecting them. And these civilians are a very important weapon the Israelis use to conquer Palestinian territory. They're often armed and protected by the Israeli government. And oftentimes they are green-lit to scare them off their land and terrorize them any means necessary. And you can see it in the documentary, because Palestinians do not want to leave their land, Israelis often have to resort to force, but they don't want their military to be seen as implementing this force, so they will often employ these settlers who go from having rocks to guns by the end of the film. And you kind of wonder who gave these civilians weapons. And the answer is pretty obvious, because you literally see the army protecting these civilians who are actively harassing and threatening these Palestinians. What's striking about how the footage is organized in the film is how much worse things have gotten since Basel's father was young. From Basel's home videos, we can see that every attempt his family has made to peacefully resist Israeli occupation has been met with intense violence. And in a lot of ways, Basel's fight is much more grueling and vicious than his father's. And although his family has made a dent, it has not saved his children from having to continue the fight. He still studied law. However, because of the economy and all the restrictions the Israelis have placed on them, he was never able to practice it. And through these conversations between Basel and Yuval, we can see the enormous toll this has taken on him. And this occupation is not just a physical trap, it's an emotional one, it's a mental one. I think Yuval's presence in Basel's life is a cruel reminder of how different and how much better life could have been if they were not occupied by these Israelis. And I think knowing that a better life exists and not being able to access it is a very difficult feeling to overcome. And what was striking about the film is you see them trying. They are trying to resume life as normal. They're trying to go to school. But this Israeli occupation, because they place a lot of this infrastructure in civilian territory, it quite literally suffocates them. It makes it almost impossible for them to resume life as normal. I think their time together, Basel and Yuval, helps the audience really appreciate how exhausting and how dangerous resisting can be. Now, despite all their best efforts, all the articles that they're able to write fall on deaf ears. And anyone reading Yuval's articles want him dead. I think one of the reasons the demolitions in Masafer Yatta did not really get the coverage it deserved is because the number of conflicts in the Middle East have actually increased. And so people have become desensitized to the issue because there's just so many issues in this region. And one of my favorite lines from the documentary is when Basel is describing change as drops of water. Individually, they have no impact, but if you keep doing it, eventually a change will come. And that's what their articles feel like, drops of water in a puddle of just forgotten pieces of writing. However, all this footage that they have shot together really has accounted for something. I think the way they were able to organize all this footage, I mean, this is like thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of footage, really highlights how everything in Masafer Yatta and everything the Palestinians have had is a result of just persistence and patience. Even the school that Basel went to was built after a demolition order was made. The men worked at night, the women worked in the morning. The only thing that has been able to limit Israel's reign of terror has been the international community, most of whom unfortunately side with Israel. In the case of Masafer Yatta, it just didn't draw enough attention, and the Israelis were able to take advantage of that. And as a result of that, the people in this community, they have two choices. They can either leave or move into a cave. Masafer Yatta is actually home to a number of ancient caves that have now been occupied by families with nowhere else to go. I thought simply watching these families move all their belongings into a literal cave really spoke to how the Israelis have totally erased their humanity. The way the documentary frames the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians is that of builder and destroyer. The Palestinians build and the Israelis destroy. And I thought the friendship between Basel and Yuval offered a blueprint in how that relationship could potentially change. During their time together, Basel and Yuval helped rebuild the community, or what's left of it. And as the demolition orders are carried out, people are getting very angry. However, they still accept Yuval into the community and they still try to talk to him and hear him out. At one point, Yuval is asked, how can we be friends when your countrymen destroy my home? And Yuval's presence and other Israelis that try to report on Palestinian suffering are a threat to the Zionist government who seeks to divide and conquer any means necessary. And the Zionist narrative tries its best to pit Arabs against Jews and conflates any criticism of Israel as an attack on the Jewish people. And the Israelis have been quite successful in creating a society in which Palestinian lives are seen as less valuable than Israeli ones. And over time, it has established a clear system of apartheid, which privileges Israelis in Palestinian territory over Palestinians. And because they have been validated time and time again by the international community, Israel has been able to argue the legality of their very corrupt and deeply sick society. Until this point, Israel has managed to convince the world that not only are they capable of self-governing, but they are also capable of managing their relationship with the Palestinians without outside interference. Yet every order that seeks to encroach on Palestinian territory is approved, and any violations of international law is just seen as a necessary evil. By forcing them out of their homes to live in caves and these crowded apartments, the Israeli government has made it clear that the Palestinians are to have no other land to call their own. To make matters worse, the only form of resistance the Israelis have approved is death. They can either die or just take it. Anything else is anti-Semitic. And one of the points that Basel makes is that although the Israelis are militarily and technologically superior, they will never win. And it's very clear that Palestinians will not leave their land. Like, they will die trying. And I think the Israelis, I mean, the way they're conducting themselves, they come from a people who died and suffered for the exact same reason Palestinians are dying and suffering from today. The documentary ends with the attacks on October the 7th. And at this point, the Israeli government has deployed Israeli settlers to speed up the process of displacing Palestinians from their homes. The moment the current genocide in Gaza has gone viral and Israel's monopoly over the media has come to an end, Israel has been put under more pressure than ever to justify the legality of their occupation. And so far, they have failed miserably. And I think the public debates about the genocide in Gaza has drawn attention to the root cause of the problem, which is Israel's desire not just to occupy Palestinian territory, but just annex it as their own. This documentary confirms what we already know. The Israelis have never acted in good faith. They have never had any desire to work with the Palestinians and try to find a long-lasting peace. And you can literally see that by the way Israelis and Palestinians are threatened with violence if they attempt to cooperate in any way. And Israel has been very successful in creating a legal system that covers up unlawful acts and protects perpetrators. And I think the documentary is impressive in that it doesn't really have to explain anything to you. You just have to watch it, and there's really only one conclusion that can be made. And whatever the solution is for this conflict, one thing is for sure: the Israelis cannot be left to their own devices to find it. So you guys let me know what you think. At the moment, this documentary does not have distributors, so you really have to go out of your way to find it. But please look for it. I vouch for it 100%. Like, it's worth looking out for. It is worth making a short trip if you can. Please let me know what you think, and until next time.